Remember when you were 16 and wanted to play in a band? So you and your flannel-wearing friends got together and started jamming out in your mom's garage? And of course, you shared the wild fantasy that one day you could be earning a living doing it.
We had the honor to pick the brain of a lead singer who has lived that crazy dream starting at 16 years old, and now 20 years later has the wife, the kids, and still rocking out on stage as the lead singer of Disciple.
Well, actually a lot earlier than that, but 16 is the official start date. But I was in a band with one of the original band members, playing in a band that we called Disciple in 8th grade. I think we played our first show in however old you are in 8th grade. How old are you in 8th grade? 13, 12? Yeah, we played our first show September of 1990. From that 8th grade, freshman year, me and the drummer, we went to church together, and the band just kind of split up, and like 2 years later, I was a junior in high school, and he came to me one day and he said, "We need to get Disciple back together." And I said, "Okay." So we went to the church and prayed, and we asked for God to send us a guitar player. And 2 weeks later, we met our original guitar player who was in the band for about 15 years, I think. And yeah, the rest is history. So started at 16. I think we signed our first record deal at 21 or 20 or something like that. It's a two-part question, how to do it from a business standpoint, and then just how to do what God's called you to do. I think knowing that this is what God called me to do at a very young age, before I was even musical, I had a word of the Lord that was spoken over me when I was 12, when there was no band, that I was going to be in a music ministry and go all around the world. I didn't necessarily follow it or put faith in it or anything like that, but obviously that's what happened. So God definitely had a plan, and just like He has a plan for me, He has a plan for everybody. And so my advice is to seek out what that is. And in that plan that He had for me, I wasn't always going all around the world and being in a music ministry. There were times where I was roofing a house, in 105-degree weather with a white chest and a black back from bending over in the sun, for 2 months straight. So what I say to people is, you stay faithful to what God's called you to do, and you stay passionate about what God's called you to do, and all these other things that you have to do on the side that He teaches you, all these lessons. I remember even traveling with this Southern Gospel group one time, which our band is very far from Southern Gospel, and playing bass guitar for them before Disciple officially started. And I have no idea how that even happened except the Lord, but what God was teaching me through that was how to be on the road with people I didn't have anything in common with, how to be on the road, period, and how to conduct yourself professionally, when you're out and away from home and all those kinds of things. And you had to look for those opportunities in every day of what God's trying to teach you for His calling, because you think that they don't make sense. You think that you delivering pizzas at Pizza Hut doesn't make sense with, whatever God's called you to do, but I guarantee you there's something there that He wants you to, glean and take it over. And so you stay passionate about what God's called you to do, but from the business side, I think that's also true, is that you have to stay passionate about what God's called you to do over the business, because sometimes it's very tempting to allow the business to overtake. And when you start letting the business make the decisions, then that's where your heart is, and that's what you're concerned about at the end of the night. And God was very, very good to us, and was able to teach us some very powerful lessons very early on. And so it's been easier for us to keep ministry first, because I remember one time when, maybe 1995, somewhere around there, we had a concert booked in Oklahoma City, and we hopped in a van and drove all the way to Oklahoma City from Knoxville, Tennessee, was where we were from. And 8 people showed up. It was a show in a CD shop, all right? So we drove all that way, and 8 people showed up, and we shared our faith and gave our testimony, and one of those 8 people gave their life to Christ that night. And we immediately bought into that was worth it, that all that trouble and drive and all of the stuff we had to go through and then the money that we lost to go and perform for 8 people, that it was worth it. And it was, you know, it's difficult to keep that attitude all the way through, but it's, you know, we had that lesson early on that we give the same show whether there's 40 people there or whether there's 40,000 people there, that we, you know, go just as hard and we give just as much energy as we would for 40 as we would for 40,000. And I think that that's the reason why, is because in those 40 people, I know that there's somebody that needs to hear the gospel. And the other lesson that we learned one time was around the same time period, we played a show in our hometown. And on the way home from that show, we were complaining and arguing and fighting and just saying, that was terrible, you know, you were playing terrible and you were singing terrible and this was bad and this was awful and the sound was bad and you were missing parts and, you know, and like everything went wrong, you know. It's like we were just talking about, like, just complaining about everything in a big way, lots of complaining. Everything in the show could possibly go wrong. And then we get a letter, or it might have even been an email to our manager the next day. An email was just happening. It was just starting, people getting emails. And we got a letter that night there was a young man that gave his life to Christ. And his mom had been praying for him for years. And that there was this group of his friends that were there. And they were all there, and he gave his life to Christ, and he ended up like being able to like embrace all of his friends and hug all of his friends and hug his mom and all this kind of stuff. And then, you know, she shared with us that on the way home that night that he was in a car accident and went on to be with the Lord that night. And so again, God, through that, I don't think he caused that young person to die, but I do think that he brought that young person to him on the night of his death, maybe knowing ahead of time and saying, you know, that he was ready for him to be with him. Taught us a lesson that all those things that we were complaining about, you know, and look how many years later, the one thing that mattered all these years later is that young man giving his life to Christ. That it still matters all these years later, and it'll matter 100 years from now, and it'll matter 1,000 years from now, that moment. But all those other things that we were complaining about, that we were complaining loudly about and passionately about, that those things actually weren't that important. And so we got those lessons very early on, and I think that that's made a big difference.